My name is Timothy Casey, and I am a descendant of a pioneer Jackson County family. My family is descended from Isaiah Shamblin, who was here in 1820. That was 20 years before Jackson County became a county. I'm honored to speak to you today about my family's history, and in particular about my great-grandfather, Roy Lee Shamblin. Roy Lee Shamblin died 20 years before I was born. My mother was only 3 at the time. I know of Roy Lee through his son, Roy Everett Shamblin, my grandfather. This is a story of a typical West Virginia family and the tragedy that shaped and influenced their lives and does so still today. Roy Lee Shamblin was born in 1884 in Jackson County, most likely on Fisher Ridge, just a few miles where he would be murdered on July 25, 1933 on the Charleston Road, Route 21 at Goldtown, just inside the Jackson County line. The location of the incident was where the Goldtown Community Church stands today. He is buried in the Shamblin Cemetery off of Watts Chapel Road. Roy Lee Shamblin was 49 years old when he was murdered, and from all accounts, he was in good health and at the peak of his productive life. He and his wife, Rosella, had 3 children: Roy Everett, my grandfather, Helen, and Robert. They were at the time, their ages were at the time respectively 24, 22, and 17. In 1907, as a young man, Roy Lee Shamblin was working in Glen Ferris, West Virginia, with his brothers in a saloon. It was while living in Glen Ferris, West Virginia, that he met Flora Rosella Stone, and they soon after married. This is a picture of my great-grandmother. Anyway, she persuaded him to leave the saloon business, and he took up work as a candy salesman and moved to Charleston's west side. We have some more of, looks like, descendants of Roy Lee Shamblin entering the room. Unfortunately, the values of Roy Lee Shamblin have been corroded a little bit by the Casey blood that's infused us. So sometimes we have a thing called Casey time. But at any rate, he's living on the west side of Charleston, working as a candy salesman and raising his children and his family. Well, over the years, he progresses in his personal and community life. He joins the Masonic Lodge in Charleston, and he also joins the Emmanuel Baptist Church, where he was baptized in 1922. My great-grandmother's influence was working on him. In addition to his sales job, he actively invested in real estate, and he prospered. Before his death, he had purchased a fine brick home on Garvin Avenue on the west side. His ethics and honesty took this boy born on a country ridge in Jackson County to a man prominent in his community and his church. As evidence of the respect that he had earned and enjoyed in the community, at his funeral service, 850 people signed as attending. Well, this level of community mourning is not unprecedented, but it is uncommon, and it's reserved for special people. Life is full of choices, left turns and right turns. Well, one of the choices Roy Lee made was to leave his salesman job and take a position as a Kanawha County deputy sheriff. Well, in the 1930s, in 1933, the modern world was in its infancy. Cars, airplanes, telephones, movies, and radio were new, having replaced the horse and steam just a few years earlier. Some people still used delivered ice instead of a refrigerator. Back then, Charleston Shopping District was on Capitol Street. And many of you may remember the Tom McCann shoe store on Capitol Street. Well, in January of 1933, Ralph Harper and another man by the name of John Newell committed an armed robbery of the Tom McCann shoe store. They took $23 in cash and a coat valued at $18.50. It is this crime that sets in motion the events that eventually result in the murder of my great-grandfather. Ralph Harper was arrested for the robbery, and he was lodged in the Kanawha County Jail. And while incarcerated there, he was visited several times by a woman by the name of Louise Frazier. Well, Ralph somehow effected an escape from the Kanawha County Jail, and they located him sometime later, not very long later, at the home in Virginia of Louise Frazier's parents. So he was rearrested, returned to the Kanawha County Jail, where he was tried, and he was presented to the court on January 25, 1933, where he was tried in Kanawha County Intermediate Court for the crime of armed robbery. Well, the jury returned a verdict quickly, and the court imposed a sentence of 25 years and ordered that the sheriff transport the prisoner as soon as practical to the Moundsville Penitentiary. Justice was swift in those days. Observing the court proceedings that day was Louise Frazier, and with her was a friend, Henry Cano. Louise Frazier was the estranged wife of Leo Frazier, but she was also in a romantic relationship with the prisoner, Ralph Harper. At this point, I'd like to clarify some of the relationships of the characters of this tragedy. Well, they are Ralph Harper, the prisoner, Charles Harper, his brother, and Louise Frazier, girlfriend to Ralph Harper and estranged wife of Leo Frazier, and then Leo Frazier, the estranged husband of Louise Frazier. And throw into that, there's Henry Cano, a Mexican national living in Charleston. He's a friend of Louise Frazier. All of these people are associates, and they reportedly involved in bootlegging and other criminal activities. To add to this group's mix of immorality, we have Leo's wife, Louise, leaving her husband to be with Ralph. These were not good people. Well, after the trial, Louise left the courtroom and went next door to the jail in an attempt to visit Ralph. I don't believe that she was successful, but she did learn that Ralph was to be transported later that day to the penitentiary at Moundsville. The deputies assigned the transport duty that day were George Dudley and Roy Lee Shamblin. Now, Shamblin had worked as a candy salesman for 18 years, and just a few years before he had taken this job as a deputy sheriff, he joined before this incident, he had joined the sheriff's office. The exact date I don't know, but it was just a matter of a few years. Earlier that day, in the morning, my grandfather, Roy Everett Shamblin, last saw his father alive when he stopped by his father's house to borrow a fishing pole. Now, just a brief diversion from this serious topic. Fishing is an activity that runs through my family. It is both a sport and a relationship activity. Some of my fondest memories are of fishing with my grandfather. Fishing must be in our family's DNA because all of my brothers and my sons and my nephews and their children all love to fish. To me, it's interesting that I can trace this activity back to my great-grandfather, Roy Lee Shamblin. In my mind, a father loaning a fishing pole to his son is an iconic image of a close father-son relationship. Well, back to the story. Louise Frazier was desperate to save her lover Ralph from prison. She went with Henry Kano later that afternoon to a house on Edgewood Drive in Charleston, where she met Charles Harper, the brother of the prisoner, and her estranged husband, Leo Frazier. There she asked them to rescue Ralph from the deputies. Well, Charles and Leo agreed, and they enlisted the assistance of Henry Kano. Well, these three men then armed themselves and left this Edgewood home in a late model Ford, which was powered by the new V8 engine and equipped with balloon tires. Well, this model vehicle was much more powerful than the 1928 Overland Whippet that the deputies were driving, which I think was a 4-cylinder motor at the time. It's a picture of the Whippet. And so police cars of this era were not equipped with high-performance engines, radios, or lights. The only thing distinguishing this car, driven by the deputies, was a small sheriff's badge affixed to the front next to the license plate. Doesn't have a bubble on top or a light or anything. That's it. Modern law enforcement at that time was in its infancy. To illustrate, sheriff's deputies did not wear uniforms. That would only happen shortly after this incident. Well, driving the Ford sedan was Charles Harper, with Henry Kano in the front passenger seat and Leo Frazier in the back seat. They drove down Washington Street and stopped at a gas station where Route 21 leaves Charleston towards Jackson County, and there they waited for the deputies to pass. After a short wait, they saw the deputies with Ralph Harper drive past. Deputy Dudley was driving. My great-grandfather was seated behind him, and with the prisoner seated next to my great-grandfather. The Ford, driven by Charles Harper, followed and then passed the deputies. They drove ahead while they were forming their plan. They discussed blocking the road and taking Ralph at gunpoint from the deputies, but because of the amount of traffic on the highway, that plan was abandoned. Instead, they decided that they would pull alongside and force the deputies to stop. They then pulled off the side of the road and allowed the deputies to pass once again. They then began following them and looking for a place straight enough where they could pull alongside and force them to stop. Well, they found this place just a couple miles inside the Jackson County line at Goldtown. With Charles Harper driving, they pulled into the oncoming lane. Both Kano and Frazier had their guns out and shouted to Deputy Dudley to stop. Dudley continued driving. in the back seat, Ralph Harper recognizes his friends, and he begins beating on my great-grandfather with his handcuffed hands. And he yells out to his friends, "Come on, boys, I've got him." Well, at this point, Kano and Frazier began shooting into the deputy's car. It is believed that it was Kano who shot Deputy Dudley, wounding him in the arm and rendering him unconscious. The car came to a stop against a guardrail. At that time, a guard wire. They didn't have actual rails, but they. So, during this melee, Ralph Harper, the prisoner, is shot and killed. How that happened is hard to determine. The witnesses are either unconscious, dead, or they are the criminal ambushers. At a young age, I loved to sit on my grandfather Shamblin's lap in front of the fireplace. We talked about everything, and sometimes we talked about his father. This story has been shared with me many times. The critical detail that sticks with me today, unchallenged in any meaningful way by other accounts, is that my great-grandfather shot Ralph Harper with his pearl-handled .38. Harper was beating him with his handcuffed hands, and my great-grandfather responded by shooting him in the chest. All of this is taking place in seconds, not minutes. The ambusher's car stopped, Kano and Frazier exited, and Frazier continues shooting into the back seat of the deputy's car. He hit my great-grandfather in the chest. He then went to the rear of the car and fired through the back, shooting him in the head. Both shots are fatal. As far as we know, my great-grandfather died immediately. With Deputy Dudley unconscious and Deputy Shamblin dead, the ambushers then find that Ralph Harper is dead. They take Deputy Dudley and they drag him out of the car and throw him off the highway and down an embankment. He's unconscious at this time. They then take Ralph's body out by dragging it over the body of my great-grandfather and out of the car, and they then load it into the back seat of their Ford. Frazier then takes my great-grandfather's pearl-handled .38 from my great-grandfather's body. The killers then leave the scene. They head back towards Charleston. Well, all of this is taking place at about 4 p.m. in front of homes and on a busy highway. People are watching this from their front porches. The authorities are notified and the hunt is on for the killers. Well, the killers return to Charleston, crossing the new bridge at Patrick Street. They drive up what today is McCorkle Avenue to Ferry Branch Road. There Kano gets out of the car and walks into Charleston via the South Side Bridge. Harper and Frazier, Charles Harper, with the body in the back seat, then travel to Huntington by way of Ferry Branch Road to Davis Creek and to Hamblin, and then on to Huntington. They arrive in Huntington before dark. They abandon their car in an alley and the body in the car a few blocks from the home of Ralph Harper's parents. They then walk to the Harper home where they tell them that their son is dead. Leo Frazier and Charles Harper wait until dark, and then they leave Huntington, walking and hitchhiking. They come back through Charleston, and then they leave Charleston up the Elk River Road. By 7 p.m. that day, the investigation and the search for the killers is underway. In the theme of arrest the usual suspects from the movie Casablanca, they arrest everyone that they believe has any contact with the slain Ralph Harper, including Henry Cano, who they arrest. A headline in the next day's paper, Daily Mail, announces that 11 suspects are arrested in this plot. So they rounded up everybody that had a bad look on their face. With much effort, and after questioning several of the arrested suspects, including Henry Cano, it was determined who was responsible. Charles Harper and Leo Frazier were soon identified, and a national alert and a $500 reward offer was sent out for their arrest. 5 days later, in New Rochelle, New York, Patrolman Ralph Stone noticed two men loitering at a gas station. He questioned them and discovered that they were carrying guns. They were arrested, and one of the guns was the pearl-handled .38 taken from Deputy Shamblin. That gun was eventually returned to my grandfather, Roy Everett Shamblin, and today my family has that gun still in their possession in the care and custody of one of my brothers. And we have a picture of it later. We'll show it to you. After the men were identified, Kanawha County Sheriff's deputies were notified, and then Kanawha County Sheriff, the High Sheriff, and several deputies, and Kanawha County's prosecuting attorney went immediately to New Rochelle, New York, where they took the prisoners and returned them to Kanawha County and placed them in the Kanawha County Jail. So, this case is unusual because the murder is committed in Jackson County, albeit just inside the county, but it was being investigated primarily by Kanawha County law enforcement, including the Kanawha County prosecuting attorney. So why was Kanawha County taking the lead in spite of the jurisdiction clearly with Jackson County? Well, it's easy for me to understand. You see, Roy Lee Shamblin was a personal and close friend of the Kanawha County Sheriff, Carl Andrews, and of the Kanawha County prosecuting attorney, Blackburn Watts. This was very personal to both of these Kanawha County officials. When I say friends, I do not mean acquaintances. These were close friends to the victim. To give an example, Carl Andrews' name frequently came up in conversations I overheard between my grandparents. I didn't know who he was at the time, but I knew he was important and a friend to my grandparents. Blackburn Watts shows up in many places in my family's history. A few years after the murder and trials, Helen Shamblin, surviving daughter of Roy Lee Shamblin, married Joe Watts, son of Blackburn Watts. Much later, in the mid-1950s, Blackburn Watts, I think at the recommendation of my grandfather, hired my father, Patrick Casey, as an assistant prosecuting attorney, starting him on his legal career. Indictments for murder were returned in Jackson County, and on August 7, on August 7 they were returned against Leo Frazier, Charles Harper, and Henry Cano. The trials were conducted in Jackson County, but with the prosecution handled by Special Prosecutor Blackburn Watts. Charles Harper was the first to be tried. He was convicted of first-degree murder, but because he was only the driver and didn't fire a gun, he was sentenced to just life imprisonment. Well, Henry Cano, he was the second tried. He was tried twice. The first trial was thrown out because the jury was unable to decide on a verdict. Reportedly, some of the jurors wanted only a second-degree murder conviction, while the majority wanted a conviction of first-degree murder. At his second trial, a verdict of first-degree murder was returned, and a sentence of life imprisonment was imposed. Leo Frazier, he was the last to go to trial. During his trial, he took the stand and claimed that his intent in the ambush was not to free Ralph Harper, but rather to kill him for breaking up his marriage. Right. I mean, the guy's going to prison for 25 years. I think this deed is done. It's obvious that she's been hanging out with him a long time. If he wanted to kill him, he could have done so at any earlier time. Why go through all this? But at any rate, he further claimed, while taking the stand in his own defense, that while he was in the process of killing Ralph Harper, Deputy Shamblin attacked him, and he had to kill Deputy Shamblin in self-defense. Well, this incredible reasoning as a defense earned him a verdict in under 2 hours of guilty of murder in the first degree, and an order that he be executed by hanging at Moundsville on November 24, 1933. Well, finally, there's Louise Frazier, and she had put these events of July 25, 1933 into motion. Well, she was indicted for first-degree murder as an accessory before the fact. She entered a plea of guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 15 years imprisonment. Well, Leo Frazier, he's scheduled for execution on November 24, 1933. Pretty soon after his conviction. Invited to observe the hanging on that day was my grandfather, Roy Everett Shamblin, and his younger brother, Robert Shamblin. He was only 17 at the time. And Harley Shamblin, the deceased's older brother. By today's standards, a wait of only 3 months, 5 days from sentencing to execution is fast. But looking at other executions at the time, this was not unusual. But having a 17-year-old witness a hanging seems a little hard to take. But this boy had just lost his father. He lost his grandmother a couple of years before that, and now he loses. Now he's witnessing the hanging. This tragedy struck my family very hard. While I didn't come around for another 20 years, I did know many of the surviving family members, and I noted the effects that this crime had on them. One of the first on the scene after the police was Roy Lee's brother, Harley Shamblin. He reportedly broke down when he saw his brother's dead body still in the back of the car. My grandfather, Roy Everett, was fishing that day. The family was unsure exactly where he was, so the state police went looking for him, and they found him on the Coal River. It was there, on the banks of that river, that he was told of his father's murder. My mother, Bobby Lee, was 3 years old at the time. She didn't remember her grandfather, but she grew up with some of her family members severely and permanently affected by the tragedy. My great-grandmother, Flora Rosella Stone Shamblin, she was born on Christmas Eve, 1886, in Boone County, West Virginia. At the time of the murder, she was only 47 years old and in good health. She died when I was a senior in high school. I knew her well. She always went by Rosella, but to me, she was Great Mama Rose. Rosella always carried herself with poise and dignity. She was the classic woman of her era. Her house was always orderly and appointed with fine furniture, and you had the sense that she was an important person. When you were in her presence, you were on your best behavior, and you didn't even have to be told. Unrelated to the events that occurred on July 25, 1933, but still affecting the family, was another tragedy. In September 1931, just 2 years before this event, the home of Dryden and Theodosia Stone, parents of Rosella Shamblin, my great-grandmother, was set on fire as a reprisal for Dryden informing police of liquor law violations in the community of Hernshaw, West Virginia. Rosella's mother, Theodosia, died in the fire. Several persons were involved in this murder. And on August 13, 1933, just a few days after the murder of my great-grandfather, two defendants, William Price and Charlie Bruce, were tried for murder in Kanawha County, the murder of my great-great-grandmother. Well, this, on July 25, 1933, you can imagine that this loss is still fresh. But it, and it is now compounded by the loss of Roy Lee. When my great-grandmother was told and given the news of her husband's murder, it shocked her so badly that she lost the ability to speak. Medicine today, we take it for granted, but it was far behind what we have. We don't know why she lost her voice. It was an additional and long-lasting tragedy for the family. While otherwise physically healthy, she never fully recovered her voice. When she spoke, if you were unfamiliar with her, you could not understand her. This disability affected in a large way my relationship with her, as communication is largely nonverbal or through a third party, such as my grandparents or my mother. They had, over time, developed the ability to understand her. Well, as a child, you're sometimes unaware of the problems that your adults are facing or dealing with. I now recognize, upon reflecting on the countless conversations I had with my grandfather, Roy Everett Shamblin, that he was dealing with these problems. I spent most summers with him on his farm, and I was probably about 5 or 6 years old when I became aware of my great-grandfather's murder. This would have been about 25 years after the event. That seems like a long time to a child, but to an adult, 25 years is recent history. I now can see that the stories told of my great-grandfather, his life, his values, and of his death was my grandfather remembering his father. It wasn't clear then, but today it is. My grandfather missed his dad in a very profound way. And he honored his father by patterning his life and his values after him. It was unique to the times in 1933, I believe, but today it seems odd that part of the response by the High Sheriff of Kanawha County to this tragedy was to hire my grandfather, Roy Everett Shamblin, to replace his deceased father on the force. This happened within a few days after the murder, and my grandfather went on to serve for about 10 years after that in his father's place. Well, financially, after the crime, the family was okay. Roy Lee had invested well in real estate, and so his widow was able to stay in her home. And this was before Social Security, so you had to provide your own security. However, some 8 years after the murder, the West Virginia legislature finally awarded a widow's pension to Rosella in the amount of $40 per month on what they expected her to live on the prior 8 years, but at least it was done. Well, I'd like you to pardon me and bear with me as I add my personal thoughts on Roy Lee Shamblin's legacy. Values like DNA flow from the past to the future. Like everyone, I received DNA from my ancestors, but no less important, I learned their values and ethics. When we speak of receiving an inheritance, we think of money or property. Well, I'm descended from people who started with little and worked and earned what property and prosperity they enjoyed. The most valuable inheritance I have received are the values and ethics of my family. From my grandfather, Roy Everett Shamblin, he is the bridge to these ethics and values. What I learned can best be described as ethics. That's him with the fish. He was very proud of it. We still have the fish too, by the way. It's mounted. Honesty with my grandfather was paramount. Your word was your bond. Discipline was always stressed, and work was required of all who were able. These were constant themes of conversations and stories. I dearly loved my grandfather. He was my ideal hero. He was tall, strong, brave, hardworking, fun, honest, and loving. He knew how to do everything that fascinated a child: fishing, hunting, building, and interacting with fascinating people. The people I met through him, I can't describe. They run the gamut from high to low, all fascinating people. The lessons I learned from him when I wasn't even aware that I was learning still guide me today. I remember his mantras, which didn't make sense to me then as a child, but became true and guiding to me as an adult. Work is its own reward. You don't have a lick of sense till you're 40 years old. Yeah. Dogs and children crave discipline. And my all-time favorite, especially when you were leaving, he would look you right in the eye and command, "Do right." As I reflect on those lessons, I now recognize that he was passing on what his father had given him, And I know this is the source because of those hours spent on his lap as a small child and those days together when we worked in the garden, hunted and fished, and he talked of the lessons that his father had given him. Those same lessons I and my siblings have passed on to our children with the full expectation that they will be passed on by them. This is the legacy of Roy Lee Shamblin that enriches and guides the lives of his future descendants, many of whom are here. Today, there are over 50 living descendants of Roy Lee Shamblin. Now, just bear with me one more thing. An interesting thing happened while I was researching this about 25 years ago that will always amaze me. Although I'd heard the stories from my grandfather, I had not read any of the newspaper accounts or the official records. A couple of years after my grandfather's death, I became curious, excuse me, and asked my grandmother, on what date did my great-grandfather die? Well, she expressed that she couldn't remember. It was such a long time ago, she said. So I set out off on a search. I started with checking with the Kanawha and Jackson County clerk's offices, looking for a date of death. Neither county had that record. I guess from the confusion at the time, no one thought to record the death. My next step was to visit the library and search the newspaper archives on microfilm. Since I didn't have a date, I just started with January 1930 and began reading every front page, certain that this was going to be big news at the time. This was going to take a long time. After about 2 hours or so, I think I'd searched up to about late 1932, early 1933, and I was about to quit and go back to my job. It was at that time, a few feet away, I heard a man at the reference desk asking the librarian if she had any information on the murder of a deputy sheriff in 1930. The coincidence was stunning. The man was asking was Deputy Sheriff Mike Rutherford. What are the chances of two men that didn't even know each other at the time to both decide to go to the library on the same day at overlapping times to research a crime that occurred well before both of us were born? Well, I got up and I introduced myself and explained how I was searching. He agreed to continue my efforts, and I left to return to work. Within an hour, he called me with his success. I leave it to you to ponder the source of this amazing coincidence. It still stuns me to this day. Deputy Rutherford later was elected sheriff in Kanawha County, and he was instrumental in having Roy Lee Shamblin added to the National Law Enforcement Memorial in Washington, D.C., and to the State of West Virginia Memorial at the Culture Center in Charleston. Since 1796, over 22,000 police officers have lost their lives in the line of duty. Each one of them, I'm sure, left behind a family, and I have an inkling of how it must feel to have lost a police officer, friend, family member. I want to thank you all for your attention. Apologize for any mistakes.